Oh, hello. I was just enjoying a delicious beverage from my interactive distractions cup. And come to think of it, why do I have this thing again? Indus is a podcast that a friend of mine used to work on, and when I was at one of their events, I decided to take some swag and never really got rid of it. I've never listened to one of their episodes in my entire life, so I couldn't tell you if they were any good or not, but the point is that I don't really care whose name is stamped on this cup, cause it's still a perfectly fine cup. See what I did there? So it's been a couple weeks, and the dust surrounding the Phil Fish issue has mostly settled. So now might be a good opportunity to look at this beast of a story a bit more holistically than what we may be used to. The gist of it involves the creator of a game named Fez deciding to quit games development because he couldn't put up with hateful internet comments anymore. But like most episodes of stupid internet drama, there's a lot of backstory behind it, and a gray moral dilemma that complicates everything. When originally writing this video, I planned to make the underlying claim that Phil Fish's personality is separate from his product, and that basing one's purchasing decisions off of a producer's personality is silly. But I gradually came to realize that the internet has made things much more complicated. The action of choosing not to buy things is, in fact, dependent on more variables than just the quality and price of the final product. But that's not to say I still don't believe in my original claim. I do. But I realize that my viewpoint is in the minority here, and that may be because every contributing blunder that led up to this mess is a very new problem. This is something that couldn't have happened even 10 years ago, and it also points out a few really complicated issues about how social and economic transactions intersect with one another on the internet. And that ages me. 10 years ago, I didn't care who made Devil May Cry or what kind of person they were. They were far out of reach, and the possibility of interacting with them was so unlikely that it never crossed my mind. But now we do know that guy, and he's not always perfectly polite to people. But maybe before diving into the nitty-gritty here, I should establish some context first and clearly explain what happened. As I said earlier, Phil Fish, creator of the successful Fez game, has quit game development not because he can't do it anymore, but because he doesn't want to. The official statement from the man himself says that, and I quote, "I'm not canceling Fez 2 because some boorish fuck said something stupid. I'm doing it to get out of games, and I'm not getting out of games because I choose not to put up with this abuse anymore." For years, Phil Fish has been a public hate figure, and the straw that broke the camel's back, or the boorish fuck, depending on what you want to call it, was a new wave of angry comments swirled up by Game Trailer's employee Marcus Beer, who goes by the stage name of the Annoyed Gamer. Phil Fish stepped down the day after Marcus Beer made these comments to both Fish and John Blow in particular. And I quote, "You were the guys who did Indie Game the movie, and some of you looked relatively normal in it, one of you looked like a total tosspot in it, but you can't have it both ways. You're successful game designers, you're indie game designers. Hurrah, good for you, you fucking hipsters." And this next one happened a bit later. Having seen these wankers over and over again bitch and moan, Phil Fish in particular, and then a little later after another guy talks, he's a fucking asshole most of the time. So what did Fish do to deserve all this vitriol? Apparently he didn't want to answer Beer's emails about the next Xbox. And I mean, I get that Beer does like one of those incendiary angry news rant shows, and that Game Trailers is allowing him to do stuff like this, but I worked in a newsroom once and learned very quickly that public figures don't owe reporters quotes, and that you're also not allowed to call them assholes. Anyways, contrary to my own personal taste, Fish and Beer apparently don't go well together, and the two just get more bitter when you put them together. And so this is what Fish said in response to Beer's angry rant. "Hey fuckface, the thing with us tosspots, hipsters, is that we're not beholden to media leeches like you. And you're right, we're very successful. And we're not going anywhere. Get used to it, you middle-aged parasite. Compare your life to mine and then kill yourself."
Compare your lives to mine and then kill yourselves.
The reason why Phil Fish became a public hate figure is because outbursts like this are not an isolated incident. He has a history of insulting people on Twitter, which became especially visible after his appearance in Indie Game the Movie. Compared to the other two subjects of the documentary, Fish looked like, well, a nervous wreck.
And I'm having a panic attack about this. I feel like I'm gonna cry, throw up, and pass out all at once. My breathing is all weird. I'm gonna lose my shit. I'm gonna I'm gonna kill him. I'm gonna fucking murder that guy, and it's gonna get everybody in trouble. We're gonna get kicked out of PAX or some kind of horrible disaster like that.
And this has been going on since before the movie too. So what we have here is a guy with terrible PR who, despite his bad reputation, released a successful game that was very well received critically. But as it was coming out, I heard a lot of people say that they weren't going to buy it based on his personality alone, and that's always kind of bugged me. In fact, if Phil Fish had been born 10 years earlier and still made Fez at around the same point in his life, then it probably would have gained much better word of mouth. Most obviously because he wouldn't have had an outlet. Twitter wasn't around, auteur game developers weren't widely publicized, and commercially successful indie games were much less common. The act of buying a game was still a simple exchange of money for a service or good, and the experience of engaging with it as a product never really escaped from the product itself. But as the years went on and corporate game budgets rose to unsustainable new heights, the rise of smaller, cheaper, and more independently produced games also means the rise of cheaper PR. Most of the time, when a game is not released by one of the few largest game publishers, then things like the distribution of review codes, the scheduling of interviews, and the ticketing of tech support problems are all handled by the developers themselves instead of external agencies. And now that we have social media, a lot of those interactions are now happening on just one public channel, like Twitter. And since the voice on one end of that channel is the voice of a successful media creator, then that voice is put on a pedestal. People are now treating game developers like they're celebrities. They're holding them to a higher moral standard than they do their friends, families, or even themselves. And this process of turning game developers into celebrities is amplified by the successful, scrappy underdog narrative that things like the indie game movie helped popularize. But I don't think that that kind of narrative is necessarily realistic or healthy. No offense, but all the game developers I've met are a far cry from the kind of charismatic social butterfly that people expect celebrities to be. Game development is still a really nerdy thing to get into. It taxes your technical skills far more than your people skills, and some of the most awkward moments of the indie game movie were those that made it clear that these guys are probably not that interesting to follow around all day. They're just on their computers all day because that's their job. Furthermore, the making of a successful indie game is not necessarily an underdog effort that just springs out of nowhere from pure creative energy. It requires years of professional experience and honed skills that you can only get from working in the industry for a very long time. The guys who made FTL used to work on Call of Duty. The guy who made Papers, Please is a former Naughty Dog employee. Phil himself used to work at Ubisoft, and holding these guys to higher standards than that which we hold ourselves to only obscures the fact that they're the same kind of human being as the rest of us. So people are idolizing game developers and also directly interacting with them personally, and as a result, getting involved with the game now means more than just getting involved in its worlds, mechanics, or art. If you're a really hardcore fan, then you follow the developers on Twitter and you like them on Facebook, and you're not just following the company name, but the individual name of the people behind it. You follow their personal lives and their professional ones, and when the things that developers are doing in their personal time falls under the high moral standards of their audience, then naturally people will disapprove. And what they will do is voice their disapproval with their dollars. Even when the product's good. I mean, Fez scored well, and according to Fish it sold well, but none of my friends bought it, and the reason they cite why is the guy behind it. It seems that what people are doing is drawing a line between how much support they want to give a developer and how much support they'll get in return. And the degree to which you measure how important their support is going to be a subjective matter, up to the individual rather than the collective. You can't measure it, but it might help clarify your worldview if you try. For me, the things that Phil Fish has done to generate so much negativity are just too petty for me to care. And of course, his personality doesn't affect the quality of the game. You actually have to go out of your way to experience his personality deliberately. He wasn't selling his Twitter account, he was selling his game. It's not his job to be nice to people on the internet, it's his job to make games. Right? There was never any news of anyone getting hurt or exploited during the process of making this game, and it's not like he was using the money to support any kind of malignant political agenda. The worst bits of actual, tangible, game-related news about Fez involved technical issues that were apparently not bad enough to hurt its review scores. And since the game turned out okay, then I'm not gonna pretend that hurting people's feelings on Twitter made Fez a worse product to buy. In fact, I've always been kinda confused as to why people spend so much energy getting mad at this guy. Seems to me like the kind of people who tell you not to feed the trolls are the same kind of people who got offended by Fish the most. But anyways, the awful things he said were just baseless, meaningless internet insults that didn't change a thing. And in order for me to support that statement, let me cite a few examples of how much impact Phil Fish's statements have had on the real world. During Fez's development, Phil Fish said that he would kill himself if he would not be able to complete his game.
What would happen to you personally if you couldn't finish the game?
I would kill myself.
After releasing Fez in an admittedly unfinished state, Phil Fish did not in fact kill himself. In the fall of 2011, Fish announced that Fez would not be coming to PC, and that PCs were for spreadsheets. In the spring of 2013, Fez came to PC, and it was not a spreadsheet. After it came out on PC, Fish called PC gamers, quote, fucking ingrates, end quote, and said that they should be grateful that he was charging only $9 for the game. During the preceding summer sale, Fez's price dropped to $5 and earned at least $500,000 in gross revenue from sales volume. He then thanked PC gamers for being so cheap. And last but not least, during a Q&A panel in 2012, Fish said the Japanese games these days suck.
What do you think about the recently Japanese game?
Is it what is about Japanese games that inspired us?
Recent.
Most recent
I'm sorry.
They suck. I'm sorry, like, you guys need to get with the times
And wouldn't you know it, but not all Japanese games these days suck. The previous statements were ignorant generalizations or dishonest exaggerations. Since they did not predict change or represent reality, then we can all look back and realize that giving them any attention at all was a silly thing to do. But because people were so offended by them, we got sensationalized headlines about every little insignificant thing this guy did. As long as it wasn't peachy clean behavior, Phil Fish was always in the news for something. You know, as small as this channel is, I still get a new comment like every other day asking me to kill myself, because I had the audacity half a year ago to explain why I wasn't super excited about the next PlayStation. It doesn't take a lot to set people off on the internet, but since this channel gets a lot more support than it does harassment, and since I'm not gonna kill myself, then I can't bring myself to dwell on it. You can't respond to stupid internet negativity with stupid internet negativity of your own. That just turns it into a pissing match. Piss gets all over everything and stinks up the place, and before you know it, there's just too much piss to clean up the mess. All this pissy toxicity on the internet isn't going to go away soon. It's gonna take a massive cultural change in the way we communicate online, and that could take decades, if not generations. And I've been seriously speculating on some kind of institutionalized solution to this problem, like the Independent Game Developers Association penalizing members who actively worsen the median's reputation, but Phil Fish's reaction is such a special case that I don't really think they could enforce new rules for his case without censoring others. In the unglamorous, mudslinging battle that pitted Phil Fish against the internet, neither side was the good guy, and those who didn't want to demean themselves and get involved still lost. When you get down to it, the only real solution to this problem would have been for at least one of those two sides to just make the best of it. But since no one did, we have one less game to play, and the problems everyone had with Fez now can't be corrected in a sequel. In any case, despite Phil Fish being mean to people on Twitter and saying that I would be a cheap fucking ingrate to buy his game on sale, I bought it on sale anyways for $5 because I choose to separate the quality of those comments from the quality of the game. So if you don't want to support this guy because of the hateful bullshit he's said, then that's totally fine. That's a valid and justifiable reason not to. But what I want you to do is measure how much that offsets the cost of the game itself. Give it some kind of dollar value so that you know how much you're going to charge people for taking their insults online. And then, after you've done that, take a look at where you've drawn the line and then ask yourself if you're still allowed to enjoy the works made by the following inflammatory personalities: Hideki Kamiya, Cliff Bleszinski, Total Biscuit, Quentin Tarantino, Alfred Hitchcock, and Bjork. So one last thing I'd like to do before leaving here is a little Fez review, analysis, interpretation, whatever you want to call it. But in order to hammer the point home further, I'm gonna pretend that I'm reviewing this game in a world in which Phil Fish saying mean things on Twitter actually matters. Fez is a 2.5D retro-style puzzle platformer with excellent pixel art that's so cute I can barely contain myself. The core gameplay is running and jumping. That's familiar territory for this genre, but it gives you a perspective-changing mechanic that cycles the 3D camera from one flat, two-dimensional angle to another. Changing perspective doesn't always change the depth of the image or the relative position of the characters, so it's a hugely disorienting optical illusion that takes a good while to get used to, and makes way for some clever geometry puzzles. But one time on Twitter, Phil Fish said gamers are the worst fucking people, so this one gets an 8.8. The real problem with Fez is that the creative potential of that perspective-changing platforming was left untapped. It's mostly there to obscure the position of platforms, so all you need to do is just scroll through every angle until you see the platforms point in the right direction. It's great when you're using it to transdimensionally tear your character through layers of geometry, but those are exceptions to the rule. Most of the time, that mechanic makes the platforming less of a puzzler and more of a procedural, and it turns navigation that could have been a crazy mind trip into a more thoughtless and uninteresting process. And that's surprising, because the game is more about puzzles than anything else. You gotta grab collectibles to progress, and a necessary chunk of them are hidden behind doors that are only unlocked by deciphering hidden messages, scanning QR codes, or decoding cryptic symbols. And again, some of these puzzles are just the coolest ones around. You actually have to keep a notepad handy to jot down keys and ciphers, but like the trans-dimensional platforming, this is an element of the game that had a lot of potential that was unfortunately mismanaged. Also, don't forget that one time Phil Fish called PC gamers ingrates, and that makes the game less fun. For example, there's a boiler room in the beginning of the game that has these tetronymos on the wall. Those tetra symbols refer to controller inputs that you learn from the screen in this room towards the end of the game, but those posters in the boiler room also have coded numbers on them that you don't learn until you get the puzzle cube in the middle of the game. So you backtrack all the way back and try to figure it out, and I just don't know what I'm looking at. How do I translate this into Roman numerals? I never figured this out, but as it turns out, I didn't need to. There's an entire alphabet of coded English that a lot of this game's lore and puzzles are written in, but you can still beat the game through the lame platforming alone. You'd barely have to scratch the surface of it to see the credits roll, so if you're not going for total completion of Fez, then it doesn't really feel like you beat it after all. I guess that's the reason why there's a New Game Plus mode that's there to facilitate the completion of leftover puzzles, or maybe I'm just an idiot, cause most of these puzzles sailed far, far over my head. I wanted so bad to feel like Indiana Jones deciphering these cryptic hieroglyphics, but I ended up just feeling like the dumbest person in the world. And since the required number of collectibles to beat the game can be grabbed just by the platforming, then why bother with the puzzles? They're really just there for the kind of people who enjoy that stuff. There's one puzzle in particular that took the internet weeks of collective brute force unlocking to figure out, with entire communities inputting as many combinations as possible to figure it out. They had to work together to keep track of their codes by collectively documenting massive lists of potential solutions. There's some tragic irony in the fact that this game will be remembered for bringing the internet together to break egos rather than solve puzzles. In fact, making a rocky jump from game to real life is a running theme surrounding the whole project. The most complicated puzzles and translations actually yield fairly uninteresting rewards, which seems more than fitting if you're aware that the game's creator likes to troll people online. Anyways, I mentioned how you gotta scribble in notepads and scan QR codes earlier, but the game's cheeky self-awareness is most visible during the ending. It deconstructs the game bit by bit, right down to its vertices and its pixels, to the waveforms that make the music and the wireframe meshes that make the geometry. But that's pretty inconsequential stuff. Fez isn't about uncovering some kind of pretentious poetic truth or making a metaphor out of play. It's still an old-school video game at heart. It's primarily there for your own lighthearted amusement. Don't read too much into it. Those puzzles are as hard as they are for the simple pleasure of solving them. Is it worth $10? Was it worth $5? Well, there's not much these days that isn't worth $5. Fez is marketed as a fun and cute retro platformer, but in reality it's more about cracking some of the most hardcore puzzles I've ever seen in a game. I know that there's a small niche of math nerds out there who really like puzzles and codes, but I can't recommend it for the general audience outside of that niche. Also, 3 years ago, Phil Fish told someone to suck his cock on Twitter, so I guess the game objectively sucks balls and doesn't deserve a sequel.
I have no business being here, and I want to thank you all for showing me where I'm at. You really showed me where I'm at today. I was just trying to do my best. But you ruined everything. Every time I'm trying to go the wrong, I have to do my best. Thank you very much.